The 8,633rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order.
Under South Africa's presidency of the Council, a strong focus on cooperation between African regional organizations and the United Nations, as the importance of women and youth in conflict prevention and mediation takes a central role in this debate.
Pour le développement durable,
we are working in full alignment with the AU through our joint framework on sustainable development for a peaceful and prosperous Africa with a strong focus on inclusivity, women's rights and gender equality. Women's meaningful participation and leadership will strengthen our responses and are essential to lasting peace.
This was an opportunity to present several case studies of the role women play in preventative diplomacy that more than often has a direct link to the social and economic development across Africa. Take the South African Women in Dialogue and the broader African chapter, both born from the work of the Zanele Mbeki Development Trust that facilitates the engagement and organization of women from the grassroots level up in conflict resolution and capacity building, particularly on gender mainstreaming, with efforts to correct any misconceptions about their role.
Most often, initiatives like SAWID are looked upon as soft approaches of maintaining peace and preventing conflict, and as a result, most conflict strategies neglect these initiatives, often prioritizing the development of their militaries, infrastructure development, and other development priorities. Yes, these are important issues to prioritize. However, it is essential for governments to recognize that the project of rebuilding societal links, acknowledging the pain and trauma of citizens, and actively investing in the healing of nations is also of paramount importance and is by no means a soft matter.
Highlighting that preventative diplomacy's not always been a central pillar of the work of this council.
We therefore, as African women, offer that through the African Women in Dialogue platform, this pillar can come to fruition, arguing or urging you to join us as civil society and support grassroots level dialogues led by women in their diversities and oneness. We hope that following this briefing, the UN Security Council will resolve to embrace, support, and adopt the practices of inclusive dialogue as a credible, viable tool for preventative diplomacy, and thereby implore others to do the same.
Nothing about us without us. This is a famous say in Burundi. Mr. Secretary General, we are here and ready and willing to be deployed in any peace mission, in any mediation, in any peacekeeping forces. Don't look far. The African Women Leaders Network and FemWise are at your disposal, Mr. Secretary General, when you are searching for able and qualified women to assist in your good offices and diplomatic efforts. The South African legendary singer, Yvonne Chaka Chaka, defined women, Mr. Secretary General, as well-organized men. So we are together in this.
South Africa is expected to introduce a presidential statement for negotiation to enhance the women, peace and security architecture before the end of the week.
Amandra, aluta continua. Thank you.
Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Well, our correspondent at the UN, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joins us now for more. So, Sherwin, as you've said there in the report you gave earlier on women who are literally at the coalface for peace and security, this is a long-standing issue. They want representativity, they want access. But why is this being brought to the UN Security Council now?
Well, we're almost 25 years after the Beijing Platform of Action was adopted at that landmark women's conference in Beijing in 1995. And of course, the lodestar of work as it relates to women and peace and security in the Security Council is what's called Resolution 1325. This was adopted, Tsepiso, in 2000. And it, for the first time, was a formal and legal document, one of its kind, in the Security Council to support women's participation in peace negotiations and in post-conflict reconstruction, and to protect women and girls from sexual and gender-based violence in armed conflict, right? That's in 2000. We are almost 20 years since that landmark resolution, so we can actually look at some of the data to say how far have we come. And the answer to that is not very much. I was just drawing on some of UN Women's data that they have on their websites, a piece, and I'm just going to read you a little snapshot. Between 1990 and 2017, women constituted only 2% of mediators, 8% of negotiators, and 5% of witnesses and signatories to major peace deals. This is quite inadequate. Women's participation in peace negotiations increases the durability and the quality of peace. So, as the rationale goes, we need more people, more women around those negotiating tables. And this is one that jumped out at me. In 2017, women's representation among military troops and police officers serving within UN peacekeeping operations remained at a low 4% in terms of military troops and 10% in terms of police officers serving as blue helmets in peacekeeping operations. I think those numbers speak for themselves.
So, Sherwin, let's talk to some of those women who made representations, including Saweed. I believe that you spoke to some of them and you were just analysing some of what they had to say.
Well, there was a lot said in this debate, right? We had interventions from 3 women civil society representatives, including a former high-ranking Tanzanian official who is now teaching at the African Studies Institute at George Washington University in Washington. And as you mentioned, someone from the South African Women in Dialogue and the African chapter. Let's listen to some of the concerns they raised, Tsepiso, and I'll speak to you after that.
Violence against women remains perhaps the most pervasive human rights violation in the African continent and in the region in particular. The absence of and lack of African women participation in formal mediation processes at the peace table in particular is an important area of the UN Security Council 1325 agenda that remains poorly implemented.
Okay, Tsepiso, so really some of the concerns they raised there, including Naledi Maita of the South African Women's Dialogue, she talked about the lack of adequate resources. You know, when we talk about Africa, we often talk about the curse in terms of the minerals and the proliferation, or in terms of mining minerals in Africa. The resource curse in terms of the women's agenda is a lack of funding for these kinds of dialogues. And so what these civil society interventions were looking at is really the Security Council placing a greater deal of importance on the role that they can play. And in one of those sound bites, they talk about 60% attendance by grassroots women from villages, women that don't necessarily have visas or passports to travel to capitals of the world. Those are the people that are most affected by conflict in Africa, and those are the people that these civil society activists want to see around the table and in the room in terms of forging ahead in terms of peace negotiations on the continent.
So, Sherwin, as you said, from a policy design perspective, this has been long in the making, 25 years, but the preventative democracy architecture is in itself rather involved in contentious issue. Has there been consensus now moving forward about how to include women?
Well, the consensus, I think, comes with whether you talk in the national jurisdiction in terms of legislation, right? You don't need consensus to implement the law. And that is similar in terms of international law and in terms of resolutions of the UN Security Council. There is a document called 1325 that demands of member states that this needs to happen. Of course, implementation is where we are seeing the gaps. And there's now a resurgence as we move towards the 25th anniversary of Beijing and the 20th anniversary of 1325. 2025 for greater implementation. And my understanding in that piece, we talked about a presidential statement being introduced for negotiation. We now understand, Sepiso, that the South Africans are going to introduce a resolution to really 45-13-25 in terms of implementation as we move towards the deadline of 2030.
And as you say, South Africa pushing for this idea, Sherwin, and being head of the Security Council now at the moment, as an instrument, how are they going to ensure greater role of women in this, especially peace and security? As you say, it's about implementation, but is there anything else that they would want to introduce?
It's incumbent, Sepiso, on member states to implement the resolutions and certainly the documents of the Security Council, whether the ones passed by the General Assembly, which are not legally binding. There is a moral responsibility on member states to adhere to those pretexts or prescripts. And certainly in terms of international law, in terms of resolutions of the Security Council, this is a legally binding instrument that member states have to implement. What the UN is always telling us, Sepiso, is that they don't have a police force to implement these resolutions, right? So whether you're talking about sanctions in the DPRK or sanctions wherever, the implementation of those sanctions comes from within those jurisdictions. So it's for the citizens of countries to keep member states in check. It is for the South African men and women to demand the implementation of these resolutions from their governments. And I think that is what the United Nations really is, a convener of ideas, and it's really up to member states to implement. So South Africa might not have as big a stick as one might think, having been president of the council, but they're certainly using the leverage they have now to push this agenda to the fore. And let's not forget who the head of UN Women is at this time, a former deputy president of South Africa. I'm sure she's got a direct line to South Africa's ambassador, Sepiso.
Very strategic position indeed. Thank you very much, Sherwin, SABC correspondent at the UN headquarters, Sherwin Bryce-Pease.